Top 10 waiver wire stashes ahead of week 14. This is it. This is the big one. 4 teams on a bye in our final playoff push. As always, you know the drill. Our goal here is to get ahead of the game and get a jump on your league mates. We are predicting which players could be the top waiver wire ads, and we are snagging them now for free so that you don't have to spend your FAAB if you have any FAAB left or your waiver wire priority to get them. Let's beat the waiver wire together. Also, if you've got any start sit questions, drop them in the comments. I've gone back and forth trying to figure out how to prioritize these late surging receivers because we have a few to talk about in this video. And the more that I contemplate, the more that I am starting to think that the most important flex stash might actually be John Metchie. Now, hear me out on this one because it does take a certain level of trust to jump in head first and feel comfortable starting a fourth-year player whose best career performance was technically last week and literally just arrived to the team a couple of weeks ago and is on an objectively awful team with quarterback inconsistencies. But Tyrod Taylor was a massive improvement on the pass volume that we had seen from Justin Fields, and that was in a fairly difficult matchup. I would feel a lot better about this if the Jets could actually be trusted to start Taylor rest of season, but the odds are in his favor and the upcoming schedule is fantastic. Now, a good chunk of that pass volume increase went to Breece Hall. Fantastic. Yay. It was good to see the checkdowns come back, but the big winner here in the receiving core was definitely John Metchie. Adonai Mitchell continues to struggle, and Metchie has been extremely reliable. In week 11, Metchie had 3 receptions on 3 targets for 45 yards and a touchdown. And in week 12, he had 6 receptions on 7 targets for 65 yards and a touchdown. Week 11 was against New England. Week 12 was against Baltimore. Now, we definitely get into a very extremely soft stretch here for the Jets, and that's what makes this more appealing. We've got Atlanta, Miami, Jacksonville, followed by a middle-of-the-road matchup against New Orleans, and then a matchup against New England, where we literally just saw Metchie have 13 fantasy points in the first go-around, and that was with Justin Fields, so there would probably be improvement in the rematch with Tyrod Taylor. As long as Taylor remains quarterback, I'm very much on board with Metchie. Look, things are getting weird at quarterback, and as I'm looking through the rest of season schedules and week 14 matchups in particular, streaming options are getting very thin. And if you had to ask me for a quarterback whose rest of season schedule makes them a weekly viable streaming option, they have a good week 14 matchup, and they are below 40% rostered, the answer that I'll give you is Tua Tagovailoa. I haven't really talked about Tua too much this year, despite the fact that I have literally talked about every single one of his offensive weapons, like every single one. I've talked about the weapons because they have a very friendly rest of season schedule. This week's matchup against New Orleans is very middle of the road. Then there's a week 14 matchup against the Jets. And we've already seen Tua against the Jets way back in week 4. And that was when the Jets actually still had all of their players intact on defense. And it was still a difficult matchup. And Tua had 16 fantasy points. Very reasonable, very respectable. It was a low volume game, just under 200 yards. But he did have 2 touchdowns and no interceptions. Then you got matchups against Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Tampa Bay. Those are all pass friendly. Do not be shocked if we see Tua go on a little bit of a hot streak here to close out the season, especially with the looming return of Darren Waller, who has been a touchdown magnet for him earlier in the season. Zonovan Knight is questionable, but logged multiple limited practices this week, so while we need the official word on his status, it does seem very possible that he plays this week, and this is critical. The Cardinals are in a very strange spot at running back. Not a single running back has truly been effective over the past couple of weeks, but the backs still are fantasy relevant because Jacoby Brissett is so successful at pushing volume and checking down and providing goal line opportunities. So it is a good situation, despite the fact that the team is technically struggling from a winning perspective. And we had Trey Benson this week. He logged a limited practice on Wednesday, and then he was downgraded to a did not practice, a DNP, on Thursday and Friday, and he has been ruled out for week 13. That screams that Benson might have had a setback. Unfortunately, though, we don't actually have a way of knowing if that was why he was downgraded. We assume that Benson would be back, but straight up not practicing is a bad sign. That's a terrible sign, and the Cardinals have been rather evasive regarding timelines here. When Jonathan Gannon was asked whether or not it was possible that Trey Benson would be shut down for the year, Gannon simply said, 1 day at a time, like quote unquote, like that was it, literally just 1 day at a time. The Cardinals aren't a competitive team, that is not a real answer. It is possible that Benson really isn't just right and they have no reason to actually risk it long term for him. So they could just end up calling it a season for him. Amari DiMercado is dealing with a high ankle sprain and he does not appear close to returning. Knight has struggled again in terms of yardage in recent weeks, but despite the fact that he isn't getting a ton of volume on the ground, his receiving work helps make up for it and he does get those goal line touches. He's had back-to-back weeks of 13 to 14 fantasy points in PPR. And if Knight is unable to go, just a contingency plan there, if Knight is unable to go, Michael Carter would be the next man up. He would genuinely be the last man standing, and his value would definitely come through in receiving work as well. I know it feels uncomfortable saying that you want to roster a wide receiver from Tennessee, but I've talked about it before. We continue to see improvements from Cam Ward as the season goes on, and for our purposes, our fantasy purposes, the Titans are very comfortable with letting him push volume and throw the ball. They are not limiting him, and that's all we really need there. In week 12, Dike had 5 receptions on 7 targets for 44 yards and a touchdown, and he also gave us a touchdown in the return game as well, so it was a great day from a fantasy perspective. And even when Alec Ayamaner is on the field, that is not necessarily a threat to DK's workload. They are two extremely different players. Like, straight up, they are not and cannot be used in the same way. Ayamaner is more of an additional weapon for Cam Ward, not a weapon that is going to take away from DK. Now, we only have one slight issue, and that is why DK is not our top priority, despite the fact that you guys know that I love him. This is a stash video, and it is both for next week specifically and long-term purposes through the fantasy playoffs. DK really would not be an ideal start next week in a matchup against Cleveland, so keep that in mind. But there is still a matchup against San Francisco ahead, and then in week 17, they have a matchup against New Orleans, so he still has some usable matchups left. Trust Jayden Higgins' production. Now, we talked about this in the waiver wire video. The Texans were on a Thursday night game last week, so it feels like an eternity since we last saw them. So as a friendly reminder, Jayden Higgins has absolutely ascended to the clear wide receiver 2 role in Houston. We started to see this shift back in week 8 when Nico Collins was out. That allowed them to give more snaps and more targets to Higgins and see that he is someone that is valuable and can breathe some life into this offense. Now, we got Nico Collins back. Obviously, he is the clear wide receiver 1. We're not talking about a threat to his actual role or his workload just because he did have a down week in week 12 against Buffalo. But the key here is that the Texans have minimized Xavier Hutchinson's role since that week 8 game, and they have been elevating the role for Jayden Higgins. Now, CJ Stroud is finally coming back, and that is a little bit of a concern for us in terms of Higgins, because we want to see what kind of volume that CJ Stroud supplies to Higgins, because this ascension for Higgins has been with Davis Mills. Stroud very likely will heavily target Nico Collins. Still, though, the Texans aren't necessarily a low-volume pass team, so there is plenty to go around. Trust the usage here. 3 touchdowns in the past 5 games is for real. He has had between 9 and 15 fantasy points in 4 of the past 5 games, with the only down game being a really bad matchup against Denver. Brian Thomas Jr. is set to return this week, and the target share in the receiving core might get a little bit messy, but the tight end target share, that is very clear. Brenton Strange has been very consistent. Strange returned from IR last week, and he hadn't played since way back in week 4, and he had a fantastic return. Now, he doesn't have a touchdown on the season, but what his value has been from a fantasy perspective is offering a very solid floor based on volume. He has had a minimum of 9.9 fantasy points in all but 1 game that he has played in full this season. And this past week, he had 5 receptions on 5 targets for 93 yards. That is an excellent first game back from IR. And while I cannot say this for the rest of his teammates, Strange actually has one of the best remaining strength of schedules for tight ends. Several of the matchups ahead, Denver, for example, are simply very tough on receivers, and it ends up making the tight ends have much higher upside despite the overall bad matchup. Now, we were eating good at tight end earlier this season. It was plentiful. There were so many options. We could pick anyone we wanted, but with the injuries and quarterback changes, everything has fallen apart at the position. A reliable volume tight end is very valuable, and Strange has borderline tight end 1 upside rest of season. Chris Rodriguez doesn't offer a ton of upside, but he does qualify as a lead back, so we will talk about him. For reasons unbeknownst to me, fantasy managers are still buying into and holding on to Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, despite the fact that Merritt has not had more than 5 fantasy points since way back in week 5. And Rodriguez, on the other hand, has had 3 touchdowns in his past 5 games and has had a range of 7 to 12 fantasy points in 4 out of those 5 games. Now, I've been hesitant to recommend Rodriguez, and it's a very specific reason. It has nothing to do with Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt and more to do with the fact that I only like him as a player to roster if you actually intend to start him. But if you are stashing him, apples to apples, I would just rather stash a backup running back like Brian Robinson Jr. or Blake Corum for their upside if the actual lead back does go down. Because the problem for Rodriguez is that a back going down in his backfield is really not going to do much for him. His production is what it is. But it is giving you around 10 fantasy points, and sometimes that is all that you can ask for. Now, typically we are looking for stashes that will go off this Sunday, but that is likely not happening with Rodriguez given the matchup here. But at this point, we've got enough evidence that he is the lead back and therefore should be stashed. This stash brings me no joy. It brings me no joy because for my fantasy purposes, my selfish fantasy purposes, I need Sean Payton to give all the workload to RJ Harvey, but unfortunately, it seems like he has other plans. Denver was on a bye in week 12, so the last time that we saw the Broncos was in week 11, the first game without J.K. Dobbins, and the result was R.J. Harvey with 11 carries for 30 yards and 3 receptions on 3 targets for 20 yards, while Jaleel McLaughlin had 6 carries for just 19 yards, but he did get the sole touchdown out of the backfield. It's difficult to judge because that was a bad matchup against Kansas City and it was just one game. But if that game is any indication of what we can expect moving forward, it is entirely possible that Peyton will just use a split backfield and that this situation of J.K. Dobbins going out is not one that is going to shift all the workload to R.J. Harvey like we saw with Travion Henderson. And if they're going to use multiple backs, early down work for McLaughlin does make sense. And it's weird because he's not a big back by any means. He's actually a smaller back than RJ Harvey, but apparently Peyton might like leaning towards McLaughlin in short yardage situations. So it is worth keeping your eye on. Don't look at me like that. Do not judge me for this. We talked about Tua Tagovailoa, but he is not the only Dolphin that I am interested in stashing. I alluded to it earlier, but hear me out. I am interested in stashing Darren Waller. He's really not a bad stash. Look, long-term, we cannot trust him, but we are at the point of the season where long-term doesn't really matter. If he were to give us a good 4 weeks, that is all we need. That's all that we need. Now, this week, we're not entirely sure if he will be active. The words from Mike McDaniel were a little bit wishy-washy. He said that if there's not a setback, he feels optimistic that Waller will play. That's not very specific, right? It is very possible that he is activated this week and we see him return in a limited capacity, similar to the first week that he was active at the beginning of the season. Waller missed the first 3 games of the season, and then he came back in week 4 against the New York Jets, only playing 28% of snaps, but he had 2 touchdowns. Then he followed that up with a game against Carolina with 5 receptions for 78 yards and a touchdown. Then a matchup against the LA Chargers, just 2 receptions, but yet again, another touchdown before getting hurt in week 7. Again, we do need to have him activated, but if he's not activated this week, it sounds like next week is a very real possibility. And again, the rest of season schedule is very good, but quite frankly, it is one that really favors tight ends, specifically because of that week 16 matchup against Cincinnati. It sounds crazy, but Waller, if he actually stays healthy, and that's a big if, right? But if he stays healthy, he would offer league-winning upside. Usually when I am doing my 10 players to stash video, I am talking about individual players. I don't typically list defenses as stashes because I personally rarely carry more than one defense. It has to be a special situation, but this is a pretty critical one, so I will allow it here. Tampa Bay's defense is actually fairly low rostered, and a fairly low rostered defense that you can start rest of season from this point forward. Now, this week's matchup against Arizona, it's a little bit shaky. It might not give you the results that you want, but do not let that fool you. In week 14, they faced New Orleans. In week 15, they faced Atlanta. In week 16, they faced Carolina. In week 17, they faced Miami. I don't know about you, but when I read off that list, all I literally heard was that Tampa Bay's defense is facing a bunch of quarterbacks that can, will, and quite frankly, love to turn the ball over. So if you are looking for a defense to stash, Tampa Bay is the one. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can find me all across all social media platforms at It's Terra Time, so make sure that you are following across, subscribe, turn on notifications for YouTube and all that good stuff, because we are closing out the fantasy season strong. We've still got waiver wire ads, stashes, and most importantly, live Q&A every single week, Wednesday at 8 p.m. EST, where you can ask me any questions that you got and so much more.